I am a GIS practitioner. So, I've taught GIS for the past 10 years, and I do remember telling my students over and over again on the importance of pretty maps. I will probably not do that anymore in fear of more spanking from Michael. But let me tell you something about teaching GIS here in LA for such a long time. Every single pretty map that the students produce starts to kind of look the same. When you start mapping all the different variables in Los Angeles, they all kind of look the same, whether it's income or education or whatnot. And then I met the humanities through collaborations with Todd and Dana. And I think in many ways my professional life has been transformed by that, and the collaboration between practitioners like myself and critical thinkers in humanities. I think it's a recipe for great interdisciplinary projects, one of which I hope to present to you today. So I want to start out with a few clips from a movie called Metamorphosis, which I helped produce with an NHK announcer called Hori Jun. And kind of remembering different sights and sounds from past moments that bring us back to the kind of the anguish and the terror and the panic that engulfed us in times of uncertainty. So here's a Google Earth kind of rendition of and the transition from the technology to the real. And so I want to contemplate on. And these are actual sounds from the kind of crisis management center, the governmental center in the time of the explosions. And you can kind of feel the fear that embodied this moment. And then here's what the fear in the form of what we can't see, like invisible radioactive particles that were released into the air, into our communities and into our lives from the scenes taken by TEPCO officials immediately after the explosion on top of the Fukushima nuclear power plant. And then we remember, even if we ourselves were not actually physically there, perhaps in the comfort of our own safety, but the fallout persists in the news, in the air, and in our hearts. And this is a representation of 200,000 people marching and gathering around the Diet in July of 2012. A really significant moment. And one of the largest political protests since the 1960s. And this leads to the kind of practical efforts that are being done by scientists in Japan, in this case, some of my colleagues from Niigata University, venturing into the spaces that were created by this human-made disaster. And what does it mean to traverse on foot on these kind of like abandoned, stranded locations that humans are not allowed to enter and live anymore. 170,000 people have been displaced because of this disaster. And so I'm actually here representing not just myself, but AK. Who unfortunately can't be here today, but he's here in spirit. And AK is a recent graduate from the Urban Humanities program, as well as the Urban Planning program, which is also my specialty, urban planning. And we struggled to come up with a title for a project, and thinking about what has transpired this morning, I in some ways kind of regret calling it this. But I did want to add a little question mark in the end, probably to give a little escape to some spanking that we might get. But we we do believe that in some ways, an F1 is a symbol that stands now, well, it represents the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, and it's a symbolism to the kind of multifaceted complexities of the events that have taken place on March 11th. But this project kind of really embodies the risk, the resilience, Dana mentioned the disruptions of a truly highly contested space. And I think it's a type of an event, a transformative moment that provides kind of new meaning to scholars and students, and an opportunity to undertake kind of really significant research in technology, humanities, and so forth. So let me introduce to you a little bit about our project, and talking about thick narratives. This event has unfolded in so many different ways, and one example is the narratives that come from different spaces that were affected by this disaster. This is a scene from Yuriage Shogakko Elementary School in the northern section of the disaster. And we encountered a gymnasium, as you can see, filled with memories. And these are not digital memories, but these are kind of archival documents that were collected and by volunteers from the disaster zones. And, much of it is unclaimed, and it is all that is left. Or we can go to a scene of extreme sadness, in this case Okawa Elementary School, where 74 students were washed away by the waves. But I'm here today to talk more about it's a triple disaster. That we had the earthquake, followed by the tsunami, and then the nuclear disaster. So my inquiry is more about the meaning that this kind of space has now evolved into, in terms of how it has affected the community, the residents who are now displaced, the government employees who continue to work within their abandoned communities, and then the other side of things, the government, how have they reacted, the TEPCO, the electric company, who was in charge of F1, and how their narratives all interlink to tell a story. Now, the research that I've been largely involved in starts in 2011. We call ourselves the Bishamon team, and it's a collaboration between UCLA and Niigata University. And at the outset, it was myself and David Shepard who decided to volunteer time and work with these scientists, where we produce these mobile-enabled monitoring systems, sensors really. That's a combination of a GPS trackers, a dosimeter to measure radiation and then connected to a vehicle. So as we drive through the evacuation zone or affected communities, we can track and log radioactivity every second that we traverse the spaces. And then we have all these interfaces. We have brilliant engineers on the team from Japan who customize these interfaces that kind of correlate the space, the time, and the measurements into these kind of interactive, real-time dashboards that then get translated from the mobile device into, the technology behind it is actually really simple. They're these text files that then we ingest into GIS, and then we produce these maps that then get sent to the local governments for them to publish on their websites to inform their citizens on what is going on in their communities. And we produce many of these maps, and we create these map books that we hand out to residents. We also conduct different types of surveys, not only mobile enabled, but walking surveys. And the reason for this is because we prioritize certain facilities, in this case, school grounds. So while talking about standards, the standard for measuring radiation is 1 meter above ground, the scientists decided that for school grounds, let's measure 50 centimeters above ground because that is more in tune with the height of children, and that's the level where the radiation is more meaningful for measuring school grounds. And in a similar fashion, we ingest this data into GIS, we correlate it with satellite imagery, and we create these maps, again, of which we publish. We create map books, we distribute to the different schools and community members and parents and so forth. Our role here at UCLA has kind of been more in the technology, in the GIS, into creating kind of the web maps, shall I say, of these measurements. So if we look at something that is a static map, we've created these interfaces that convert these maps into interactive, dynamic maps that can be published on the web, so that community members can interrogate them on their own time, and also to explain the kind of there's a lot of spatial analysis that happens when you collect millions and millions of points over the course of 3 years. There's also, I should say, a lot of transfer of technology. A lot of this research that is done on the academic side then gets, a large part of our intent is not to keep it in academia, but to transfer the technology to the local governments, which is something that we've done. And since the technology has been transferred, the local governments themselves are now able to measure on their own. One thing I want to mention is that the true kind of interdisciplinarity of this project. We have, the scientists, medical doctors, nuclear physicists from the Japan side, and then we have the urban planner, the architect, the designer, the humanists on the UCLA side, all collaborating to create these products. Earlier this year in March, I actually had the opportunity to take some of our own students into the evacuation zone. And I took 2 urban planning students, as well as 2 urban humanities students, so there's Morgan, and AK. And all together, we kind of, I think I have a clip of this.
So we're 1.7.
Yeah, jump.
It's gone up to 2.5.
Oh, you're not.
That last moment, I was asked to take my camera down because they had all these signs that, hey, no cameras allowed. But this is the exit. Everybody has to go through this hangar where they kind of take you out one by one, and they measure you down, and they make sure that you're so safe. So kind of despite the interdisciplinary nature of this project team, I think the resulting products that we've come up with are rather kind of thin in content and kind of singular in its narrative and linear in its temporality. So it's really kind of, in fact, not reflective of the immense effort that have been performed by the scientists in Niigata, who have spent countless hours investing in understanding the human impact that the disasters have had upon the affected communities. And so, in order to humanitize the project, we proposed several kind of augmentations to the project, and we wanted to inject kind of the humanities-laden methodologies to better inform the nature of the calamity from the humanistic perspective. So how the science and the technology helps us understand these perspectives intermingled with the humanities component. So when I told of my intent to my colleagues in Japan, they kind of gave me these quizzical looks. And they were kind of, well, why should we do that? It seemed kind of like as practitioners, it's a little kind of a leap to understand what this all humanities research was and what it means, and to comprehend what value it would bring to the project. But this is kind of something that AK put together in terms of trying to help conceptualize what we're trying to do. So if you look at the, that's F1 in the middle there, we're going to draw these transit paths through the communities that we're going to interrogate. And that's the same kind of maps that we've been building based on the radiation measurements. But we want to add some other thickness to this in terms of, okay, why don't we start categorizing as we drive along not only the radiation measurements, but hey, what's the land use like and how does it impact these spaces that have been abandoned? What's the altitude of these spaces? And then what are the inherent narratives that are embedded within these spaces, whether they are narratives of the past or narratives of the present. So we've identified the agronomist, we've identified the farmer, the government employee, the TEPCO official, and the community members. And through all this inquiry, we hope, we're actually going back in December, and we hope to run these transit paths and not only measure for radiation, but also measure through film, photography. We're going to have GPS devices, and sound. I learned a new word, geophony, I think. AK found this word that means kind of the spatial alignment of sonic environments. So I want to end with AK who's not here with me today. And he asked him, well, how would you define the Urban Humanities ultimate project? And he says it is to enrich contemporary discussions of post-nuclear accidents, and I would actually argue that it's not just nuclear, but any kind of accident, long-term sustainability of ecosystems, inducing innovative approaches towards design that is human-centered, managing the way people behave, act, and respond to the unpredictable dynamics of any given environment. So to end, I think our project is emergence of science, technology, and humanities. And we hope to be what John mentioned earlier this morning, a step closer to what's the new cartographer. So, yeah, thank you.